60,000 years ago, the sun rose slower. It had to. It was pushing through Ice Age air, thick with cold and dust, a kind of ancient haze that made every dawn look like an afterthought. Somewhere in what is now southwestern France, a family stirred in the dark mouth of a limestone cave. Not yet human, not exactly, but close enough that if you were there, you'd recognize the sound of yawning, coughing, and someone muttering that it's too cold to get up. That was a Neanderthal morning. Before we learn more about our ancestors, please take a second to like and subscribe. It helps a lot and means the world to me. If you'd like to, I'd love to hear how your day's going in the comments below. Now, without further ado, they woke to frost, not alarm clocks. The first job of the day was the same as ours. Get warm, get fed, and get everyone else to do their part without complaining too much. The fire at the center of the shelter was never allowed to die. Archaeologists at Kabara Cave in Israel found ring after ring of ash layers, like a diary written in smoke, proof that the same hearth was relit hundreds of times. Someone tended it day after day for generations. That was the Neanderthal equivalent of paying the electric bill. They didn't live in chaos or filth, as Victorian science liked to imagine. Excavations at La Ferracie in France revealed orderly living spaces. One for sleeping, one for tool making, one for eating. Think open concept Ice Age studio apartment, complete with hearthside seating. The day began not with hunting or art or philosophical breakthroughs, but with maintenance. Stoking embers, scraping hides, rearranging tools. Their mornings were filled with what anthropologists call subsistence rhythm, the repetitive, necessary labor that makes a species stick around. Ours just happens to involve email now. If you walked among them at dawn, you'd notice first the quiet. No barking dogs, no bird song, just wind against rock and the low hum of breath through nostrils evolved for cold air. Their bodies were built for it. Broad chests, short limbs, thick bones, and faces that looked as if they'd been carved from the same stone they slept under. They didn't run on calendars, but seasons. Every morning's light carried its own meaning. The direction of wind mattered more than the hour. The smell of the air told them which herds had passed nearby in the night. Some mornings, they'd step out and find that a cave bear had claimed the valley below. Other mornings, the snow would be fresh enough to show the prints of mammoths or reindeer. Survival was a constant series of to-do lists, written in tracks and frost. Breakfast was usually leftover meat, mammoth if you were lucky, rabbit if not. Pounded flat and warmed by the fire. Marrow was a favorite. Researchers at Grotte du Renne found bone fragments split open with surgical precision. Someone there was a connoisseur of bone broth before it trended on wellness blogs. They dressed well for the climate, too. Excavations in Okladnikov Cave, Siberia, found evidence of hide processing and bone needles, suggesting tailored clothing rather than rough wraps. They may not have invented Paris fashion, but they did invent the parka. And despite their reputation as brutes, they liked a little flair. Red and yellow ochre pigments appear at dozens of Neanderthal sites, iron-rich powders ground into color. Some used it to tan hides, others to decorate bodies or tools. A dig in Murcia, Spain, even found pierced shells coated in pigment. Jewelry, 50,000 years before Etsy. They weren't walking art galleries, but they did understand the ancient rule of style. Survival, but make it look good. Their mornings weren't solitary. A typical Neanderthal group numbered between 10 and 20. An extended family with all the politics that implies. Grandparents, children, siblings, in-laws. Imagine a snowbound camping trip that lasted your entire life. Archaeological models show gender roles were flexible. The men hunted, yes, but women and elders gathered plants, tended fire, and prepared food. Their stone tools don't show specialization by gender, which makes sense, because when your environment tries to kill you daily, everyone works overtime. They spoke too. Maybe not like us, but close enough. The shape of the Neanderthal hyoid bone, a little horseshoe in the throat, matches ours almost perfectly, and DNA evidence from the FOXP2 gene suggests they had the same neural capacity for speech. Their voices probably sounded deeper, heavier, less podcast host, more gravel and breath. Imagine them in the half-dark, murmuring softly as they plan the day. Who will scout? Who will stay? Who will keep the fire? That's not guesswork. It's inference from evidence, the kind of planning visible in their settlements. The hearths weren't random. The sleeping spaces formed rings, and tool debris piles tell archaeologists where people sat, worked, and spoke. They weren't morning people in the way we are. No coffee, no deadlines, just momentum. Their sense of time was cyclical, not linear. Every dawn was another chance to repeat what worked yesterday. That's what archaeologists call behavioral conservatism. A polite way of saying, if it ain't broke, don't evolve it. For 200,000 years, it worked beautifully. They thrived from the coast of Spain to the mountains of Siberia. Homo sapiens, us, didn't even have a passport that broad until recently. Still, life wasn't comfortable. Their day's first decision was always the same: stay or move. The difference between a good morning and a fatal one might depend on how quickly they read the weather. At some sites, burnt bones and ash layers show they stayed for weeks. At others, there's only one hearth, one night. Mobility was strategy. In Kabara, in Israel's Carmel Mountains, excavators found multiple hearths stacked over time, like sedimentary pancakes. Each layer separated by thin ash, days apart. Families returning to the same spot, reheating the same fire, as if the place itself remembered them. You can almost hear the rhythm. Dawn, warmth, hunger, movement, again and again, for millennia. When paleoanthropologists analyze soot in these caves, they find microscopic plant remains. Grasses, herbs, resins, all used for bedding. Neanderthals made mattresses. They weren't sleeping on bare rock. They built soft layers of sedge and pine needles to insulate against the cold. One study even found traces of camphor-like plants, natural insect repellent. So yes, they had fire, tools, and bug spray before the Bronze Age got around to metal. Their mornings were full of small genius. A flake of stone turned into a knife, a bundle of twigs into warmth, a handful of pigment into identity. It wasn't a life of grand discoveries, just careful, deliberate ones, repeated endlessly until they became habit. The kind of innovation you barely notice because it's woven into survival. If Homo sapiens were dreamers, Neanderthals were craftsmen. Their mornings didn't start with inspiration. They started with repair. And as the sun climbed higher, the cave would fill with light, yellow, diffuse, cutting across stone walls etched by time. They'd step out into the glare, their breath hanging in the air, and set off toward whatever the day demanded. Wood to gather, tools to sharpen, food to find. Archaeology gives us fragments, bones, ash, pigments. But pattern gives us people. And every pattern points to this. They woke up, stretched, argued, laughed, worked, and tried to stay warm. So what did Neanderthals do all day? In the beginning, not much. just things that kept them alive. By mid-morning, the Ice Age had thawed into something deceptively peaceful. Blue skies stretched over a continent of frozen grass, herds moving in slow brown waves across the steppe. From a distance, it looked idyllic. Up close, it looked like work. Neanderthal life wasn't an endless struggle against extinction. It was an endless struggle against boredom, interrupted by the occasional stampede. The bulk of every day was spent not dying, which, contrary to modern assumptions, takes quite a bit of skill. They didn't have farms, markets, or refrigerators. What they had was rhythm. A system of cooperation so ancient it left no bones behind, only patterns in ash and stone. A few kilometers from the morning's cave, the group spread out, men, women, even adolescents, scanning for signs of game. They weren't wanderers by choice. They were logistics managers in fur coats. Archaeologists can still trace their movements through Europe by the composition of stone tools left behind. The flint at one site might come from 50 kilometers away. Proof that someone had mapped the land in their head long before anyone drew a map. At places like Le Moustier and La Quina in France, dig layers are littered with what anthropologists call Mousterian tools. Flakes, scrapers, and blades chipped into perfect utility. Each one took hours to make. They'd sit cross-legged, striking flint against stone, turning geology into technology. The process was methodical. Hit, rotate, hit, adjust. Repeat. It wasn't brute force, it was muscle memory. If you've ever watched someone sharpen a chef's knife in complete silence, you already understand their mindset. We once mocked Neanderthal tools as crude until microscopic wear analysis revealed the opposite. Many had dual edges, one for cutting hide, one for slicing meat, the prehistoric equivalent of a Swiss Army knife. Some even show traces of resin and sinew, proof they were hafted onto wooden handles. That's engineering, not improvisation. And their craftsmanship wasn't limited to stone. At Schöningen, Germany, archaeologists found 8 perfectly balanced wooden spears over 300,000 years old, carved from spruce and weighted like Olympic javelins. A hunt began hours before any animal appeared. They'd fan out silently across open ground, reading tracks, gauging wind direction. When the time came, they didn't chase. They cornered. Spears weren't thrown from afar like in movies. They were thrust at close range, dangerously close, which explains the fracture patterns on Neanderthal bones. Many of them broke ribs and shoulders in the line of duty. Hunting wasn't just bravery. It was attrition, and it was collective. Excavations at El Sidrón in Spain uncovered the remains of 12 individuals, a family, scientists believe, all showing genetic ties. Their bones carried chemical signatures revealing diet. Mostly meat, yes, but also nuts, mushrooms, and pine seeds. They weren't lone wolves. They were dinner clubs with better endurance than we give them credit for. Some mornings, the hunt failed. Then came the improvisation. Neanderthals were opportunists. They scavenged carnivore kills, used fire to drive herds, cracked open marrow bones others left behind. The fossil record shows cut marks layered over hyena bites. Proof they weren't first at the feast, but rarely went hungry. Still, the image of constant violence doesn't hold up. At a mood cave in Israel, archaeologists found the bones of a child carefully buried beside tools and animal horns, evidence of care, not conquest. The idea that life was one long saber-toothed chase misses the point. Most of their work looked like this: sharpening a flake, cleaning sinew from bone, scraping hide smooth for warmth, mixing ochre with fat to treat leather, gathering edible plants and herbs, repairing fire pits. They were craftsmen before they were warriors. Every act of survival was a small act of patience. Flint knapping wasn't just about tools, it was about thought. When neuroscientists reconstructed the process in modern humans, they found it activated Broca's area, the same part of the brain responsible for language. In shaping stone, early humans literally learned to think in sequence. The idea that one movement leads to another, that rhythm produces result. That's the birth of planning. In other words, before we spoke fluently, we chipped. And that's the secret to understanding what Neanderthals did all day. They worked with their hands so much that their brains followed suit. Intelligence was a side effect of craftsmanship. At Krapina, in Croatia, scientists found eagle talons cut and strung into necklaces. No practical use, just decoration, which means they had time to be vain. That's civilization in its earliest form, having enough surplus minutes in the day to make something you don't need. At La Côte de Saint-Brelade, on the island of Jersey, they herded mammoths off cliffs, coordinated, terrifying efficiency. But at home, they carved bones, shaped pigments, and arranged living spaces. Violence and beauty weren't opposites to them. They were consecutive chores. Neanderthal social life revolved around proximity. Archaeological hearth layouts show tight clusters of individuals, people sitting elbow to elbow, repairing, sharing, teaching. It's easy to romanticize, but that closeness wasn't optional. In sub-zero weather, distance kills. Warmth required bodies in contact. You can imagine them swapping stories, teasing each other over tool mishaps, arguing about who wasted good flint. We know from El Cedron that one adult female and 2 children suffered from malnutrition. Yet others in the group lived long past crippling injuries, meaning someone fed them, someone cared. That's the difference between instinct and community. Every time a Neanderthal stopped napping to hand a tool to someone younger, civilization advanced by half an inch. Even their pace of life tells a story. Modern humans live by the minute. Neanderthals lived by the migration. Their work wasn't productivity, it was continuity. When an animal bone shattered wrong, they didn't discard it, they reworked it. When fire died, they reignited it from embers. It's telling that the archaeological record contains so many repaired tools, reshaped stones, reused flakes. Efficiency wasn't a goal, it was a worldview. Waste nothing, because replacement required effort, and effort required survival. Somewhere between hunting and maintenance, they found the first sense of meaning. Anthropologist Ian Tattersall once wrote, "They had an inner life we can't measure, but we can see its footprints. A footprint of routine, repetition, and resilience." By evening, the day's work began to unwind. The spears leaned against cave walls. Meat smoked gently on wooden racks. Stone flakes littered the floor like confetti from a celebration of persistence. Children pressed lumps of clay into the dirt, copying the motions of their parents. They didn't know they were practicing the habits of a species that would outlive them. They only knew that to stay alive was to stay moving, carving, fixing, teaching, sharing. Tomorrow, they'd wake and do it all again. The same tools, the same fire, the same motions repeated with the same precision. And that's how you endure for 300,000 years. By the time the sun dipped behind the Ice Age horizon, the wind softened, and the world turned into a cathedral of cold light. That was when Neanderthals became themselves. Daylight belonged to survival, but night That was for memory. The fire was their only technology that glowed. It wasn't just warmth. It was cinema, comfort, and congregation all at once. Every evening, they sat around the same circle of stone and watched the same show. Flames moving like language before language existed. At La Ferracie in Shanidar, archaeologists found hearths surrounded by compacted soil. Proof of countless evenings spent sitting, talking, working, and eating in the same arrangement. The same footprints, layered like ghostly attendance sheets. Firelight changes the human brain. It lowers cortisol, slows heart rate, makes eyes focus closer. Anthropologists call it the campfire effect, the neurological calm that may have made storytelling possible. So when you imagine a Neanderthal staring into the fire, you're seeing the origin of narrative itself. The first binge watch was a flame. Around those fires, they didn't just eat. They reflected, at least as much as anyone can reflect with a vocabulary of grunts and gestures. Archaeologists used to call them mute brutes, but their remains argue otherwise. The famous Shanidar 1 skeleton, found in northern Iraq, belonged to an adult male who'd been blinded in one eye, lost an arm, and suffered a crushed foot, yet lived another decade. Someone fed him, cleaned his wounds, kept him alive. That's not instinct. That's compassion, which means empathy is older than civilization. And that makes the Neanderthal campfire the birthplace of kindness. After the work of survival came the work of meaning. At Bruniquel Cave in southern France, explorers discovered something extraordinary. 400 feet underground, a ring made from broken stalagmites, stacked deliberately into a circle. Burn marks around them show firelight. It's 176,000 years old, long before Homo sapiens ever showed up in Europe. No one knows what it was for. Some think it was ritual. Some think art. Some, the world's oldest real estate project. But whatever the purpose, it means one thing. Neanderthals went into the dark for reasons beyond necessity. They didn't need to go that deep. They wanted to. When archaeologists first saw it, they didn't call it spiritual. They called it behavioral complexity, science's favorite euphemism for wonder. We tend to draw a hard line between us and them. They hunted, we painted. But in 2018, uranium-thorium dating rewrote that story. At 3 Spanish cave sites, La Pasiega, Maltravieso, and Cueva de los Aviones, researchers found red pigment art dating back 65,000 years. That's 20,000 years before modern humans reached Europe. In other words, Neanderthals were painting in caves before we arrived to take the credit. At La Pasiega, they outlined ladders and shapes on the wall. At Cueva de los Aviones, they decorated shells with pigments and strung them like jewelry. They weren't doodling. They were symbolizing. Art, it turns out, didn't start with us. We just started curating it. Their evenings weren't silent. In Slovenia's Divje Babe Cave, archaeologists found a hollowed-out bear bone with 4 neatly spaced holes. Some said it was from scavenging animals. Others, including musicologists, pointed out that the spacing matched the scale of a flute. Try to picture that? A Neanderthal sitting by a fire, blowing breath through bone, filling the night with the first melody in history. If true, that would make the Divje Babe flute the oldest musical instrument ever discovered. Roughly 60,000 years old. Older than agriculture, older than pyramids, older than heartbreak. It also means that before we sang hymns to gods, we hummed to each other in caves. Firelight also revealed vanity. Pigments found in sites from France to Croatia suggest body painting, not for camouflage, but for decoration. Ochre powders mixed with fat, smeared on skin, sometimes paired with eagle feathers or beads. At Krapina, researchers found eagle talons strung with fiber, worn like jewelry. So in the evenings, after a long day of butchering mammoths, someone took the time to look in a pool of water and think, needs more red. They weren't just surviving, they were presenting. And that small act, the decision to be seen beautifully, is civilization's favorite pastime. If we could sit among them, the first thing that would surprise us isn't the smell or the silence. It's the familiarity. The gestures. A hand brushing ash off a thigh, a parent calming a child, someone staring into the distance too long. All recorded indirectly through bones and space, the way archaeological layers tell a story in sediment instead of sentences. Evenings were when Neanderthals remembered. We know because they buried their dead. At La Chapelle-aux-Saints in France, a skeleton was found curled on its side, knees drawn in, placed in a shallow pit. Not dumped, arranged. At Shanidar, pollen grains were discovered around one burial, once interpreted as flowers. Even if that part remains debated, the intention doesn't. They treated the dead differently. That's not just grief, it's ritual. A recognition that absence deserves choreography. It's easy to think of them as primitive because their art didn't scale to cathedrals. But maybe that's missing the point. When you have no written language, one gesture becomes infinite. A burial becomes philosophy. Anthropologist Penny Spickens once wrote that Neanderthal society may have run on emotional intelligence more than hierarchy. You didn't need a leader when empathy was the currency. That might explain how they lasted 250,000 years longer than most companies. Their nights were short, their fires long. Imagine the scene. The wind dies. The group huddles closer. Children fall asleep on furs. A woman hums. A man adds a stick to the fire and watches the sparks climb into darkness like constellations they'll never name. At Gorham's Cave in Gibraltar, researchers found a series of deliberate cross-hatch engravings carved into the rock, 40,000 years old, geometric, abstract. No one knows what it meant, but its location, near the entrance, visible in firelight, suggests intention. A signature, maybe. A mark to say we were here. It's the same impulse that drives us to carve initials in park benches. A need to defy impermanence with scratches. That's art and immortality, reduced to one gesture. So, what did Neanderthals do all night? They did what we still do. They sat near heat. They told stories they couldn't quite explain. They looked at each other and wondered what comes next. The difference is, they didn't need screens for it to feel profound. When archaeologists sift through the ashes of their hearths, they find traces of burnt bone, pigment, seeds, but also time. So much time. Layer upon layer of it. Enough to prove that for hundreds of thousands of nights, people just like us ended their day by sitting down, not saying much, and watching the light move. They were the first to discover that survival without reflection is just endurance. And somewhere in that flicker, in the hum, the carving, the burial, consciousness finally realized it was awake. Tomorrow, they'd hunt again. But for now, the fire burned low, the stars stood still, and the Ice Age warmed up. If there's such a thing as the first bedtime story, it happened here. In a cave, under flickering light, told by someone who didn't yet know what words were. They didn't disappear in a blaze or a battle. There was no sudden collapse, no last stand in a cave. They simply faded quietly into the snow. The Ice Age ended not with a scream, but a long, slow exhale. A world warming by inches, glaciers retreating while forests crept back over the plains. The mammoths moved north, the rivers shifted course, and what had once been a Neanderthal paradise, open grassland and cold air, perfect for heavy bodies and short limbs, became a trap of trees and time. Around 40,000 years ago, the last of them were still waking up each morning, still tending fires, still hunting in valleys that had grown too green. They lived the same way they always had, because it had always worked before. But the world had changed its rules. The air was softer, the animals fewer, the winters harsher in ways they couldn't predict. The wind carried scents that were no longer familiar, and eventually, the sound of strangers. Those strangers were us. The first encounters between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals were probably not cinematic. No duels, no chaos, just an exchange of glances across a valley. Two species of human, each recognizing something in the other that felt unsettlingly familiar. They might have smelled each other before they spoke. Maybe they traded food, maybe suspicion, maybe curiosity. When we finally spread into Europe, we brought something they didn't have: numbers, language, endurance, and an annoying willingness to move. They were strong and deliberate. We were restless and organized. They preferred routine. We preferred novelty. They built camps and stayed. We built routes and traveled. For thousands of years, the two species coexisted, and for a time, the border between us was more like a handshake than a wall. In the layers of Grotte de Rennes in France, archaeologists found Neanderthal tools lying beside bone ornaments and pigment jewelry, artifacts once believed to be uniquely modern, which means they weren't just watching us. They were imitating, adapting, trading. They learned. And at Oase Cave in Romania, the bones of a man who lived 40,000 years ago tell an even deeper story. His genome was 6% Neanderthal. His great-great-grandparent had been one of them. The last Neanderthals didn't vanish. They married into the family. For centuries, we thought of them as evolutionary dead ends. Our slow, unlucky cousins, lost to progress. But in 2010, Svante Pääbo and his team at the Max Planck Institute changed everything when they sequenced the Neanderthal genome from bone fragments in Vindija Cave, Croatia. The results overturned the myth overnight. Every living non-African human carries 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA, which means they're not gone. They're sitting in the passenger seat of your genome, humming softly while you worry about emails. That DNA influences far more than we expected. Our skin tones and immune systems, the way we metabolize sunlight, our body's inflammatory responses, even some of our emotional chemistry, all carry echoes of them. There's evidence that Neanderthal genes affect circadian rhythm, pain sensitivity, and mood regulation. So when you stare at a fire too long, or feel something ancient and unnameable while watching snowfall, that might be an inheritance. They didn't die out. They dissolved into us. Still, extinction isn't a single event. It's a process measured in generations. Climate change, shrinking populations, and bad luck did their work slowly. When the ice retreated, forests spread across Europe, and the open plains that once teemed with reindeer and mammoth vanished beneath trees. Their short, heavy bodies, built for cold, open terrain, weren't made for forest hunting. The world had shifted toward endurance, and our species could walk prey to exhaustion. The biological equivalent of having a better logistics department. Disease may have played its part too. When Homo sapiens arrived from Africa, we brought microbes with us, invisible invaders to which Neanderthals had no defense. Add in a few bad winters, dwindling numbers, and an environment that punished solitude, and the outcome feels inevitable in hindsight. But to them, it probably felt like another cold season to endure, another migration to wait out. The last generations weren't watching history collapse. They were just trying to make it through the next morning. In Gorham's Cave in Gibraltar, a wind-cut hollow overlooking the Atlantic, archaeologists found soot stains just 32,000 years old. The blackened rock is still there, layered like fingerprints. It's the last known Neanderthal hearth. Imagine it. A family huddled against the cold, the sea below roaring like a memory of something bigger, their fire still burning while the rest of the world changed shape around them. That wasn't extinction. It was conclusion. We like to imagine progress as a ladder, each rung another triumph. But evolution isn't linear. It's more like sediment, each layer blending into the next until distinctions blur. The Neanderthals didn't fail. They simply became part of the next layer. And yet, we can't stop digging them up. Every bone, every tool, every pigment-stained shell feels like a mirror we can't look away from. Because what we're really excavating isn't their past. It's our origin story, written in the grammar of hands, hearths, and habits. We look at their skeletons and see our proportions. We reconstruct their faces and see our cousins, our neighbors, sometimes even our friends. The most unsettling thing about them isn't how different they were. It's how similar. Their eyes look back at us across millennia, not with alien coldness, but with quiet recognition. It's hard not to wonder what they'd think if they could see us now. The descendants of their own DNA, still gathering around light in the dark, still adorning ourselves with colors, still telling stories about survival and meaning. They'd recognize the posture, knees pulled close, hands cupped around warmth, minds wandering beyond the flames. We tend to romanticize them, the noble cousin who never made it past prehistory. But maybe that's the wrong way to think about it. Maybe they were never meant to last as they were. Maybe their purpose wasn't to endure, but to merge. To hand us the torch and trust we'd keep the fire going. Introgression, scientists call it, the blending of genes across species lines. But that word is too clinical for what really happened. It wasn't data merging. It was continuity. A relay, not a replacement. We didn't steal their future. We inherited it. By the time the last true Neanderthals died, they'd already succeeded in the only mission that matters to a species. They'd passed something on. And today, in every heartbeat, every gesture, every moment of quiet empathy, they still exist, not as ghosts, but as structure. In our hands, in our faces, in the way we love firelight. We carry them like memory carries scent, subtle, persistent, unmistakable once noticed. The bones in museums are just the shell. The real Neanderthals are still walking, still building, still dreaming. Only now they're ordering coffee, paying rent, worrying about deadlines. Civilization, after all, is just an upgraded cave. So what did Neanderthals do all day in the end? They did what we still do. They woke up, found food, tended fires, told stories, raised children, cared for the sick, buried their dead, and wondered, in the quiet moments between survival, what it all meant. Their days were slower, their nights darker, but their lives were not smaller. They simply had fewer distractions, and when the last embers of their last fire dimmed, the light didn't go out. It just changed hosts. It passed from one species to another, one morning to the next, until the glow reached us. Standing here tens of thousands of years later, still watching the sunrise, still trying to make sense of what to do with the day. Thank you for spending a part of your day learning a little bit more about our ancestors. Have a great rest of your night, and I'll see you next time.